When I introduced David Skaggs as a speaker at one of our meetings about a year ago, I commented that in addition to his sterling credentials, he was one of the few remaining true gentlemen in the world, and that he has been singing in the choir of First Congregational United Church of Christ for decades. Our speaker today sings in that same choir, is another one of those gentlemen whose mother taught him never to wear a hat indoors, and has equally glittering qualifications as a speaker. Stewart M. Hoover is former Dean of the School of Journalism at University of Colorado at Boulder. He is currently Professor of Media Studies and Religious Studies and Director of the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture. He is an internationally recognized expert on media and religion, and the University of Colorado's center that he directs is one of only 4 in the world devoted to this emerging field of study. Stewart has written 10 books and numerous articles about subjects such as televangelism, religion journalism, religion in secular and entertainment media, and religion in the internet and digital media. He holds a PhD from the University of Philadelphia. Stewart has been a visiting scholar in Ghana, Brazil, and Australia, and conducted research and presented lectures in Europe. He's just back from a conference on race, religion, and media in South Africa. Please welcome him for his talk on religion, society, and politics in the digital age.
Thank you, Carl. It's a great pleasure to be here. My second visit to Rotary, to this club in the last 6 weeks, so it's fun to be back, and I'm honored that, by the way, that Abbas Rajabi could be here to hear me. We have in common Abbas's daughter, who is one of our distinguished graduates for our PhD program and was a central figure in our Center on Media, Religion, and Culture. I want to talk today about media and religion. And why you might have an academic study on that relationship. We do have a center. By the way, if you want to get back to me or give feedback or anything, these are the 2 ways to do it. One's through our center website, the other my email address at the university. I was the first Hoover to arrive, so I don't have to have any initial or anything. It's just Hoover at Colorado EDU. We're devoted to teaching, research, and outreach in the area of media and religion. And I wanted to give you an example of some of the things that our students work on so you can get an idea of what's up at the university around this issue. We look at things like virtual religion. That was a virtual Buddhist temple. This is a virtual visit to the Hajj pilgrimage site in Mecca. This is a very, very inappropriately dressed avatar visiting the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Religion and humor is a big issue for us as well. Give you a second to read this one. And there are a wide range of other ways you can look at that as well. Stephen Colbert is a classic example of humorous treatment of religion on television. We look at religion and entertainment television. I could do 6 lectures about religion and entertainment TV. It's a large category of the work we work on, but I'm not going to be focusing on that so much today. Of course, religion in digital games. It's an increasingly important part of the media economy, is the gaming economy, and religion it plays a role in many of these games. One of our students done some really interesting work on Muslim feminism and young Muslim feminists and their negotiation of fashion as a way of finding a kind of cultural and political and religious power. We, of course, look at religion and social media. This is the fabulously successful Post-Secret site, which is not a religious site, but has a lot of religion in it. And, of course, there are all the many religion apps out there. This is the latest one from the Vatican. They keep having new religion apps. This is the one in the Post-Francis era. And, of course, the Muslim prayer app. You can pray as a Catholic or a Muslim online. Much more going on. The question I want to talk about is, and sort of demonstrate a bit, is why you would study media and religion together. And the reason is, as I say here, is because religion is changing, And the media are responsible for this change. They're largely responsible. Some parts of this are familiar. We're all aware, of course, of the role that the media, specifically the printing press, played in the Protestant Reformation. We're familiar with bathrobe films like this one. We're familiar with things like televangelism, Jim and Tammy Baker, the 700 Club, Pat Robertson, the proprietor. This is what Pat looks like these days. And new versions, things like televangelism, but are different. I mean, they share in common with televangelism, but they're not connected with formal religious institutions. They're not officially representations of any religious denomination, but they're still very, very important and significant parts of the religious landscape. This is the Eternal Word Television Network, which is the Catholic version of televangelism, a very, very sophisticated channel that includes, among all of the other programs they put on, about an evening news program that's from a kind of a conservative Catholic perspective. So some of those things are familiar, but some things are unfamiliar, and they show that how religion is sort of moving outside the realm of the formal institutions and out into the world and into the marketplace of media. So digital examples like the MySpace Buddhist temple, for example, are examples of that. And this is, I think, a very interesting thing, thinking in terms of Buddhism, that the kind of formal practice of Buddhism, which goes on in temples and in community, etc., is now joined by online practices like this one, an app called Buddhify, which uses the label of being Buddhist, but actually is a mindfulness app. And there's actually a whole new category of mindfulness apps out there in digital space as well. More profound changes are afoot, though, and I want to talk a little bit about that. One way to think about that is by asking the question, what's sacred in today's culture and where is it? And we kind of crossed a Rubicon, I think, quite a while ago in the culture, and this is actually 25 years ago as an example. At that time, some of this change I'm talking about had already happened. Sinead O'Connor, an Irish singer, appeared on Saturday Night Live in 1992. At the end of her last song, she sang kind of an Irish protest ballad, and then held up a photograph of John Paul II, the Pope at the time, and tore it to pieces, saying, "Fight the real enemy." Now, the effect of this was instantaneous. She was booed off the stage at a concert the next day, or the next week. Joe Pesci was the host of Saturday Night Live the next week. He ranted and raved in a very misogynistic way about her in his intro. She essentially was persona non grata because she had kicked a sacred cow, John Paul II. Now, this should have been ironic because just about the same time, Madonna, and for those of you in the room who are a bit younger, Madonna was the Lady Gaga of her generation. Madonna had a very prodigious kind of program of contesting the Catholic Church. Her Like a Prayer, the video, was a direct confrontation to Catholic authority. This was at the same time that Sinead O'Connor tore up John Paul II. And nobody seemed to care much about what Madonna did, but this act of Sinead's was a visceral act. And it was in part because John Paul II had become a media figure. He had projected himself into public space for the generations of people who were gradually orienting toward media as their primary location of cultural identification. He was an icon. And so he was kind of a sacred cow. Whereas the church, which Madonna was confronting, no longer was. So let's talk a little bit about just some statistics that will help us understand the situation. These are Pew data, and this is a typical kind of finding now when people are asked about religious identification in national surveys. The fastest growing category is the nones, the percentage of people who say they have no religious affiliation. In this particular Pew study, I think it's around 22%. So you have about 22%, a rising number of people who say they don't have a religious identification. You also have a declining representation of people in formal religious services. Only about 36% attend weekly. It's still high for the Western world, in the industrial world, in the United States, but it's still, at the same time, it's relatively low. At the same time, 63% of people absolutely believe there is a God. And if you include the people who think, well, there probably is a God, it's like 85%. They're not going to church, they believe in God. You have frequency of prayer, about 55%. You have frequency of feeling spiritual feelings or something, about 60%, etc. What's happened is that we have a decline in institutional and clerical authority in religion and a rise in people's personal autonomy, what is sometimes called seeking or questing or being spiritual but not religious. And what happens is that trend line converges, and you have then a kind of a market for non-religiously located religious and spiritual activities, resources, symbols, etc. And the media are commercial enterprises, they act like commercial enterprises, and they rise to the occasion. So I want to say some things then about what this means, what the trends are. And all of this, of course, each of the things I'm talking about deserves a lecture of its own. But religion in the media age, religion has not gone away, but it's persisted in media and in popular culture. Media imaginaries, that's a term I'll use again, the imaginaries that media circulate, the imagined symbols and ideas that they're very good at circulating, provide powerful religious tools today. Religion has become a market, and religions, the formal, the old religions, as well as new and emerging ones, all have to compete in that market, and that there are profound social and political effects of this, and I'm going to talk about a bit of those. My topics today are two: the challenge to religious authority and religion in contemporary politics, though there are, I said, a range of things we could talk about. I want to then say the shift I've talked about. What does it mean for religious authority and religious institutions? First of all, it means they can no longer have a private conversation. It's no longer possible to have a bright line between the sacred space of religion and a space outside that's in the public sphere. And the Catholic Church, oh, I'm terribly sorry for that. I'll put it up later. The Catholic Church has experienced this recently with reference to the sexual abuse scandals. All three popes have experienced the fact that there's a media sphere out there that can look into the church, and the church can't do anything about it. And the church can be the subject of an award-winning film, that scandal. And that means that the media are out there, always able to scrutinize the church. And the media are also able to do things like this, that is, portray a figure in the church, in this case Francis, in a certain kind of way that some people in the church, particularly conservatives, I think would not be very happy about. But media are very good at these kind of galvanic, imagined sort of practices and symbols. Secondly, religious authority loses control over its own symbols. It can't control them anymore. Back to Madonna, you may not have noticed, but there's a religious symbol in each of these pictures, and it's the cross or it's the crucifix. Madonna can adorn her body in public media with the crucifix however she likes, and the church can't do a thing about it. So they've lost the ability to control their own symbols. Religions necessarily then, because it's a marketplace, they become differentiated, they become branded, and they enter into kind of a marketplace of symbols. Religion is a symbolic marketplace. It's not separate institutions so much anymore. It's out in public culture, in media culture, along with everything else. This is kind of a metaphor for that I'll put up. This is an ad along a roadside in Brazil for a wax museum. And you can see it's like religion finds itself in and among lots of other symbols all the time. And you see there are 4 religious symbols. You didn't notice that before, religious figures in this billboard. Elvis, the boyfriend in the Twilight series, who was the vampire, I forget his Leonard or what his name was, Michael Jackson, and the Pope. Those are 4 religious figures that appear in this billboard. It's not unique to Christianity or to the developed West. This is Amr Khalid. He's arguably the most popular Muslim televangelist in the world. He was, Time magazine declared him several years ago to be one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He's not a cleric. He's a real estate developer. But he wanted to bring Islam into the media. And so he became a media figure and is extremely influential in the Muslim world. Muslim Authority also faces people like this. Sheikh Mizo, he's an online radio preacher in Egypt. And sometime last year, he said it's probably not necessary to believe completely in Muhammad in order to get into heaven. You don't have to take it all, which is kind of a Protestant way of looking at Islam. This, of course, is very controversial, but he can say that. He has a platform, and the authority can't do anything about it. This is a film. This was a nominee for an international Oscar last year called Sheikh Jackson was the name of the film, and it was about an imam and Muslim imam in Egypt who was fascinated with Michael Jackson and saw Jackson's death and the impact of Jackson's death as a sort of way of thinking about faith and meaning and the afterlife, etc. And this film was created about that. And so you have a Michael Jackson impersonator in the midst of a mosque. This is something that the media can do. So that's the challenge to religious authority. Now let's turn to religion in contemporary politics. This is a picture that a lot of people seem to want to try to explain. How is it that people you would think of as otherwise conservative and otherwise people with kind of deep moral values, how would they support someone like Donald Trump, who ostensibly, well, not ostensibly, who's, paid off a porn star, things like that. He's someone who is not your typical presidential candidate in terms of his values. And yet he has very strong support in the evangelical community. He's being prayed over here by his evangelical cabinet, in addition to his evangelical vice president, Mike Pence. And I noticed that Michael Cohen's there in the background too. I just noticed that in the picture. But he has a cadre, a cabinet of evangelical pastors who are, including Paula White, who is his chaplain. So sort of how does this happen? Well, it happens in part because the media enable certain kinds of collections of power and circulations of power and symbols through media. And I'm going to talk about that in a couple of contexts here. The two things I want to talk about are a movement called Dominionism and Protestantism, and then the church militant movement in Catholicism. And I want to go on to talk a little bit about this being a global phenomenon. And the thing I think that we've identified as we're looking at these trends I'm talking about, what sort of makes this contemporary religiously inflected cultural politics possible today, is these are three themes that seem to tie together all the trends I'm talking about. Kind of a nostalgia, a desire to recover a kind of halcyon past, a focus on traditional gender roles. Men should be men, women should be women, and they should stay in their positions. And religious marking of social and political systems. Now, again, these are empirical. I'm not laying these over the data. These are what we see in the discourses and in the media that we analyze in this relationship between religion and politics today. So let's go back. First of all, the dominionist idea. These two figures will probably be familiar to you. The one on the left is our friend, the cake baker from Lakewood, Masterpiece Cake Shop baker. The person on the right is Kim Davis, who was a county clerk in Kentucky who refused to license same-sex marriages. Both of them represent a kind of movement toward marking the culture with religion and getting back to that kind of halcyon, nostalgic past. How Trump fits into that has always been kind of a mystery for people, I think many people, and this helps explain it. There's kind of a way that media imaginaries make this concatenation between Trump and conservative religion possible. Among these is a film called The Trump Prophecy, which is out in theaters now. It portrays a vision that a young man, a firefighter, had in 2011 that Donald Trump would be the next president and he would be God's chosen president. This film evokes a very interesting kind of tradition among these conservative Protestants and in Judaism as well, which holds up the figure of King Cyrus, the Persian king who freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, as a great savior of Israel. He was not a Jew himself. He was not faithful himself, yet he was a savior. This is how they think of, and how Donald Trump is portrayed in this movie and in much of this theological reflection on Donald Trump. A savior of the kind of Christianization project of American culture, even though himself is not necessarily a very faithful person. Now, on the Catholic side, you have a movement toward what's called the church militant. And the key figure in this is someone also associated with Trump, Steve Bannon, who was in the White House for a while. And Steve Bannon has been very active in conservative Catholic circles in trying to re-articulate a role for religion, again, in this nostalgic view, traditional gender roles, traditional location of religion at the center of the culture. He travels throughout Europe. We think of Europe as being very secularized. Steve Bannon gets lots of audiences in Europe for making these kinds of arguments to who we think of as these kind of neo-populist movements in Europe. Bannon himself is a media producer, as many of you know. He produced a video, which is a good sort of measure of this kind of imagination that I'm talking about, called The Torchbearer, starring Phil Robertson. In case you don't recognize him, he was Grandpa in the Duck Dynasty series. Here he is in front of the Vatican in the film, and I just want to read this. I know that we don't like to do this with PowerPoint, but the film combines Robertson presenting evangelical message of salvation through Jesus with a theory about religion's role in human history and society. Says Robertson, when you take out God as the anchor of your civilization, you open the door to tyranny, and instead of human rights, you have just want to check on my time here. Instead of human rights, you have the will to power of the ruler who makes himself the sole determiner of what is true and just. Might makes right. More specifically, it's a warning to Americans that society is not grounded in reverence and fear for the Judeo-Christian God. His teachings on right and wrong inevitably descend into depravity and into brutality. And then this is a very interesting thing, I think, for a lot of us here in Boulder to hear this view out of the film. Robertson says that the Scopes trial on the teaching of evolution, during which H.L. Mencken mocked religious opponents of teaching evolution in schools, was a watershed event that would slowly unravel the bond that wove the Creator into the very fabric of American life. God would be cast out of the public square, out of education, out of national discourse, out of the popular culture together. Gordon Gamm and I were talking at lunch about sort of what the project is, and the project seems to be one of getting back to undoing sort of those trends across the 20th century. Now, there's a global side to this, and if any of you are concerned or a little troubled by what I've just said, what I have to say now is not going to make you any more comfortable or happy. So, in addition to Donald Trump, this is also happening in Russia and also happening in relation to the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church is assuming the same role in relation to Putin that the evangelical community has taken with Trump. Putin and the triumph of Christianity in Russia is one of the headlines, and the Russian Orthodox advocates of that nostalgic, gender-normative, religiously based kind of governmental dominionism are making links with, connect with the people here in the United States in the evangelical side. They actually had a summit together in Washington last summer. The Russian delegation stayed at the Trump International Hotel, etc. And Putin sees himself as a kind of a bulwark of Christianity as it's under assault globally. He's a bulwark against the East, against Islam to his east, and a bulwark against the depravity of cultures that will do things like have same-sex marriage to the West. And he's very clear about this. And the church, the Russian church, likes this language. He talks about the eternal Christian values. This is coverage of him using Orthodox Church to build his power. He asserted in a State of a Nation address 2 years ago that Russia is morally superior in its worldview, and it's morally superior to the West, and he defends its conservative values. Now, this also, interestingly, may help explain why you have some conservative forces in the U.S. that you would have thought of as traditionally being anti-Russian because of the period of the Soviet period when Russia was so secularized officially, now being more open to connections with Russia. It's in part because from the Russian church and from Putin, you're getting some of the same language, some language that they feel comfortable with. Curiously, the same skunkworks that have gone after our elections have been going after liberal and progressive Orthodox clergy around the world. They have even been they've even crashed the website and the Twitter accounts of Bartholomew I, who is the Pope of Orthodoxy. He's in Istanbul, and he has the right to decide what happens with Orthodox communion. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, this is getting into the politics of it. You know, Russia and Ukraine are in struggle now, and Russia is trying to assert some sort of sovereignty over at least eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian church wants to break away from the Russian church because Ukraine wants to maintain its independence. And in fact, Bartholomew approved that last month. So Ukrainian church is leaving, but it wasn't without a good deal of opposition from Russian Orthodoxy and from people like the online bots and stuff that the Russians are so good at deploying. There are many reasons why it's significant. It would be a complete lecture to go into why that is. A media connection that's quite interesting is this is Tsargrad television. This is a media channel in Russia, very sophisticated, high profile. It's kind of the Fox News of Russia, a combination of the 700 Club and Eternal Word Television and Fox News. This is the proprietor, Konstantin Madevyev. Madevyev is well-connected politically. He's kind of an Russian oligarch. He funds Tsargrad TV. That is, by the way, the Tsar behind him. Tsargrad means reign of the Tsar television, so it's looking to a very nostalgic kind of Russian past and seeing the church. And a curious connection, this is former Fox News and Hannity producer Jack Hannock, who moved to Moscow in 2011 to become one of the senior executive producers of Tsargrad television. So it's not only kind of like Fox News, it is sort of an extension in a certain kind of way of Fox News. The church is also involved in setting up paramilitary groups and community groups like this group, a men's group. Again, I talked about the gender thing. Sorokov, it's a Russian version of the Proud Boys movement that is kind of supporting Roger Stone right now. And Medvedev is thought by the UN to actually be funding actual paramilitary forces who are fighting in eastern Ukraine to set up this rump republic, the Donetsk Republic that Putin would like to set up. Okay, let's go to Brazil. This is the Temple of Solomon. It's a reproduction of the Temple of Solomon built in Sao Paulo, completed in 2014. This is the leader of the church, of a huge neo-Pentecostal megachurch movement called the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which has 10 million members in 200 countries around the world, extremely wealthy movement. This is the leader of that movement, dressed as kind of an Orthodox rabbinic figure at the inauguration of the temple. This is what he normally looks like. He looks like a Pentecostal preacher, usually. In our neighborhood in São Bernardo do Campo, where we lived several years ago, this was the UCKG church in our community. It was not like the big temple. And the ones here in the U.S., there are UCKG churches in the U.S., they look like this. They have that logo, the ones in Boston, the ones in Harlem, places like that. He's also, Macedo, dear Macedo, who heads the church, also owns the second largest television network in Brazil. TV Globo is the largest. Ready Record is second. He owns Ready Record. So he has commercial media support behind him. They're known for things, that church is known for things like this, an incident where one of their preachers kicked a Catholic saint on television as a way of kind of separating Neo-Pentecostalism from Catholicism. And it's thought that Macedo is heavily involved. He is heavily involved and was very supportive, as were many of the other Neo-Pentecostal megachurch pastors in Brazil were involved in supporting Jair Bolsonaro in his recent campaign, successful campaign to become president of Brazil. This is an article from the New Humanist saying, bringing God to the ballot box, the role religion had played in the Brazilian election. And again, the connections between the US and Brazilian situation are kind of very, I don't know, chilling in some ways. All right, we could talk about Hinduism as well. So why study media and religion? By studying the interactions between media and religion, we have insights into things that are overlooked by other academic disciplines. Why do we do it? Because we need to understand these increasingly complex trends and effects. And I just went down one little stream of kind of what we do in our center, looking at the religion and politics thing. We do it in part also to inform other disciplines, political science, sociology, religious studies, international relations, law, etc. And we hope to be able to change the way that both media and religion are taught and understood on our campus and elsewhere. So I'll end it there, and I have a couple of minutes if there are any questions. Anyone would like to ask a question? Floor is open. Yes, sir. Say that again, I'm sorry.
Is there a problem now?
Yes, there is a big problem with definitions that are one of the challenges of this time is trying to understand and legitimate our traditional categories of religion, so that as people claim to be doing something that's like spiritual seeking or something like that, traditional religious authorities would not call that a fully valid or authentic religious experience because it doesn't happen in community or it's not informed by doctrine or something like that. But because religion is more and more a marketplace, people have a kind of superficial way of accessing these values and these symbols and these ideas, something that I think most theologians would consider to be superficial, at least.
Stewart, Rotary gets the last word.
Oh, okay.
So we want to thank you for such a thought-provoking presentation. Lots of meat for us to think about and questions to continue to ponder. But in your honor, the Boulder Rotary Club is pleased to contribute 100 doses of vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund. After 26 years of hard work, Rotary and its partners are on the brink of eradicating this tenacious disease. But a strong push is now needed to root it out once and for all. It's conceivable for polio to be eradicated in the next few years. It's a window of opportunity for historic proportions as we move forward with a polio in-game strategy. We partner with Bill Gates and his foundation in doing this, and Bill Gates says, if we have the fortitude to see this effort through to the end, we will eradicate polio. On behalf of the club, we thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Come back anytime.